While the world has spent decades arguing about whether the boomers ruined the economy or whether millennials killed the napkin industry, there is an entire generation that has spent that same time solving the problems nobody else wants to touch, without complaining, without asking for recognition, without so much as raising a hand to let anyone know it was them. They built the internet we are all addicted to, and barely any of them have social media. They raised children without manuals, without therapy, without the support networks we now take for granted, and they did it alone because that is simply how they learned to do everything. They are the colleague who does not need meetings to deliver results, the parent who showed up without anyone having to ask, the person who does not panic in a crisis because they have spent their whole life living in one. We are talking about Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, and they are quite possibly the most misunderstood, most overlooked, and psychologically most complex generation in modern history. But here's what nobody has ever properly explained to you. That way of being, that apparent coldness, that almost unsettling independence is not a personality trait. It is the direct consequence of a childhood that forced them to become adults before anyone thought to ask whether they were ready. And once you understand exactly what happened to them, you will never see this generation in quite the same way again.
Loneliness was only the first blow. The second was deeper, more permanent, and harder to heal, because it did not come from an absence, but from an active and repeated betrayal. Generation X grew up watching their parents preach with absolute conviction the values of commitment, loyalty, and rewarded effort, while divorce rates soared throughout the 70s and 80s to levels no previous generation had ever recorded. They watched their parents give 20, 25, 30 years of their lives to a company that dismissed them without a second thought as soon as the next corporate restructuring arrived. They watched the institutions they were supposed to trust fail systematically and without consequences for anyone except those who had believed in them. And that pattern, witnessed again and again during the most critical years of their psychological development, engraved a message into their belief system that no subsequent therapy has fully erased. The system is designed to betray you. The people who claim to protect you will eventually let you down, and promises are nothing more than words until the facts prove otherwise. What clinical psychology calls defensive pessimism, Generation X simply incorporated as a way of processing reality. They do not expect the worst because they are negative by nature. They expect it because in their accumulated experience, the worst arrives with an almost mathematical punctuality. And that emotional armor found its most characteristic expression in something that defines this generation culturally more than any other trait: irony as a mechanism of psychological survival. Everything is a joke. Nothing is that serious. Keep things light. Do not let anyone see that something matters too much to you, because the day they do is the day they have something to use against you. That mechanism did not emerge from nowhere, nor is it a cultural pose adopted for generational aesthetic. It has a concrete and well-documented historical root. This generation grew up during the Cold War doing nuclear attack drills in primary school, crouching beneath wooden desks while perfectly composed adults explained with clinical calm how to survive a thermonuclear bomb, as though the desk would make any real difference, and as though the very normalcy of that conversation was not itself a form of collective trauma. And those same adults, once the drill was over, would say that everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. That double reality, the apocalypse as school routine, combined with the adult insistence that everything was perfectly normal, trained an entire generation to hold contradictions without breaking, to laugh at precisely the moments when every natural instinct would be to scream, and to maintain emotional distance from everything, because attachment, in their experience, was not safety, but simply another way of setting your own trap.
And here is the paradox that nobody would expect to find after everything that came before. A generation raised in neglect, disillusionment, and systematic loneliness built one of the most solid, most silent, and most effective work ethics that any study on occupational psychology and generational behavior has ever documented. No manifestos, no motivational posts on LinkedIn about the culture of effort and sacrifice. No need for anyone to watch or applaud them. They simply show up and do the work, because that is the only thing that, in their experience, has never failed. That ethic was not learnt at university, nor on a corporate leadership program. It was forged at delivering newspapers at 5 in the morning at the age of 12 in any weather conditions, bagging groceries at supermarkets, calculating change in their heads when the till broke down, because there was no other option. Those were not experiences designed to enrich a CV or to develop soft skills. They were raw, unfiltered, safety net-free introductions to what it means to be responsible for something when nobody else is going to be responsible for it on your behalf. And when they watched their parents be destroyed by the corporate world after decades of unconditional loyalty, they made a decision that defines their relationship with work to this day. They would never believe in loyalty to a company, but they would become obsessed with being absolutely competent and indispensable. They could not control whether they would one day be made redundant, they already knew that far too well, but they could control being the last person any sensible organization would ever want to lose. And that is exactly what they built, in silence, without fanfare, without waiting for anyone to notice. Their absence from social media comes from exactly the same place, and understanding it dismantles one of the most widespread misconceptions about Generation X in the digital age. It is not that they do not understand the technology. They built it. The programming languages, the internet infrastructures, the systems upon which the platforms used by millennials and Gen Z operate today were developed largely by minds that belong to this very generation. The problem is not technological understanding. The problem is memory. Generation X remembers with precision what it meant to live in a world where a mistake you made was only known by 10 people, where something embarrassing from your adolescence was mentioned at a party, and that was the end of it. No screenshots, no permanent record, no possibility of an algorithm resurrecting it 5 years later to destroy you professionally. For a generation that learned from an early age that visibility is vulnerability and that the less people know about you, the safer you are, exposing your life on social media does not feel like freedom of expression or personal brand building. It feels like voluntarily handing over the ammunition someone could use against you. They observe, process, and lurk in silence, exactly as they learned to do in those empty houses of the 70s and 80s. And that same logic is what explains the most fascinating social paradox in the whole of their psychology. They are the most fiercely independent generation in existence and, at the same time, the most deeply and silently loyal. They will never ask you for help because they have been solving their own problems since before adolescence. But if you need it, they show up, without drama, without a post about what good people they are, without needing anyone to validate the gesture. They are simply there, because when your friends became your family out of genuine necessity during childhood, loyalty ceases to be an abstract value and becomes the only form of relationship you know.
Generation X's relationship with authority is one of the most misunderstood aspects of their psychology, and understanding it completely changes the way their behavior is read within any organizational, family, or social structure. It is not that they are rebels by temperament or that they have a generic problem with rules. Their stance is far more specific and far more rational than that. They respect competence, not titles. If you earned your position through genuine ability, demonstrated knowledge, and concrete results, Generation X will follow you anywhere without needing anyone to tell them to. But if you're an executive who speaks well in meetings and does not really know what they're doing, you will encounter a silent, constant, and extraordinarily effective resistance. They will not confront you in public or cause a scene. They will quietly undermine you whilst smiling to your face, because they learn early on that direct confrontation with incompetent authority rarely produces results and almost always comes at a personal cost. That distrust towards power that has not been earned, rather than merely institutionalized, has historical roots as concrete as they are well documented. Generation X grew up watching Watergate unfold in real time, the Iran-Contra affair, what many have described as the criminal mishandling of the AIDS crisis, the devastating consequences of Vietnam, and the economic policies that systematically dismantled the middle classes over decades. What they absorbed from all of that was a lesson no classroom would ever have taught. Being in charge does not mean you know what you're doing, and blind obedience is not a virtue,
but naivety with consequences. The economic blow was equally systematic and cumulative, and its effects on the financial psychology of this generation are impossible to separate from everything else. The oldest members of Generation X graduated directly into a recession. Those in the middle watched their investments and jobs evaporate with the collapse of the dot-com bubble. The youngest arrived at adult life just as the 2008 crisis destroyed markets, mortgages, and retirement plans within a matter of months. 3 distinct economic blows at 3 different moments of vital vulnerability that produced an accumulated financial trauma which explains with precision why so many members of this generation have multiple simultaneous income streams. Not because they are natural entrepreneurs, nor because the culture of self-employment holds any romantic appeal for them, but because they learned in a visceral and repeated fashion that no job is permanent, no company is loyal, and diversifying is not a growth strategy, but a matter of survival. And all that accumulation of blows, the childhood loneliness, the institutional disillusionment, the repeated economic trauma, left a scar that research in stress psychology confirms with data. Generation X reports significantly lower rates of seeking social support during moments of crisis, not because they lack people around them, but because asking for help activates in their nervous system the same signal as failure, because they were programmed from childhood to resolve everything alone. And that programming, decades later, continues running in the background without anyone having to ask it to.
Generation X is quite probably the last generation that knows what it is to be alone with their thoughts without any screen coming to fill the silence. The last that learned to solve problems without being able to search for the answer in 3 seconds. The last whose knowledge carries the weight of having cost genuine effort to obtain. They're not better than anyone else, and they would be the first to say so. They are simply different, shaped by a specific moment in history when the old world was dying but the new one had not yet arrived, which made them what no other generation can claim with the same legitimacy: the bridge, the middle child of modern history. And bridges do not receive parades. They do not appear in the headlines. They are simply there, bearing the weight, doing the work, without expecting anyone to notice. And that, precisely that, is the most Generation X thing of all. If this video resonated with you, subscribe and tell me in the comments which trait of Generation X you believe the generations of today most need to learn.